Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first installment of NCFS in Captivity. I'm Rachel Mesch. Hopefully you can actually see everyone's names on the screen. I've put this together with Masha Belenky, who along with Anna O'Neill Henry and Susanna Lee was ready to welcome, they were all ready to welcome you to Washington, D.C. in just a few months. And organizing this also with Susan McCready, setting up the tech side of things here. So thank you so much, Susan, for that. We will be your alternating MCs over the course of these dialogues, and I'll be turning it over to Susan in just a minute to kick this one off. So late last spring, as we realized that our beloved annual conference would be one of the many casualties of COVID-19, we were bereft. For so many of us, NCFS is our yearly sanity check, a weekend-long reminder of why it is that we do what we do. The exchange of ideas in a supportive and friendly environment, a conference that nurtures lifelong friendships over coffee breaks and cocktails before we return to our, shall we say, somewhat less utopic institutions. And while of course we can't quite compensate for that over Zoom, there's a lot that we can do here. And we hope that this series will help maintain that intellectual community and even build it further. We hope you'll invite your students and your colleagues and your parents, your friends, whomever you want. We can do all that with Zoom. There are no limits. I wanted to give a special shout out to Patrick Bray, who's arranged for these conversations to be shared to the H France Salon. So you'll be getting more information about that. And I would add that social media is one way we can maintain contact during this time. If you're not already in the NCFS Facebook group, NCFS Friends, please go ahead and join that. We'll be posting there as well. And if you would feel inclined to tweet through this, please use the hashtag NCFS in Captivity, obviously. Colin Foss has agreed to kick things off over there on Twitter for us, so make sure to follow him. And with that, I'm going to just turn it over to you, Susan, and enjoy, everyone.
Maurice Samuels is the Betty Jane Anlin Professor of French at Yale, where he also chairs the Judaic Studies program and directs the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. He's the author of 3 books before the one we're going to be talking about today, The Spectacular Past, Inventing the Israelite, and The Right to Difference. And he's now working on a biography of Dreyfus for the Jewish Lives series at the Yale University Press. Among Maurie's many accomplishments, he has twice won the MLA Salon Prize for the best book in French studies, but he has had to share that on one occasion with a certain Andrew Counter. Andrew Counter is Associate Professor of French at the University of Oxford. He's published 2 books, Inheritance in 19th-Century French Culture, with Legenda in 2010, and The Amorous Restoration, Love, Sex, and Politics in Early 19th Century France with Oxford in 2016. He's currently working on a 3rd book, provisionally entitled Thinking Sexual Ethics Through Modern French Literature. So join me in welcoming Maurice Samuels and Andrew Counter. And I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, I'll start. And first, I just want to say thank you. It's really an honor to be featured in the NCFS in Captivity series. Huge thanks to Rachel, Susan, and Masha for organizing this. It's a fantastic idea. Huge thanks also to Andrew for agreeing to be in dialogue with me. And thank you to all of you for coming in these waning days of summer, or for some of you, the beginning actually of the new semester. Many of you have heard me talk about this book already at conferences, but maybe you've forgotten. And for those of you who haven't, I thought I would start by just giving a little summary of the book, short 10 minutes, and then we can dive into the dialogue. So this is a book about a nearly forgotten episode in French history, but one that had major repercussions for French political culture and for the development of anti-Semitism. It's about the Duchess de Berry, a very determined 4'7" princess who led a civil war in 1832 against Louis Philippe to reconquer the throne for her 11-year-old son, the Bourbon heir. It's also about the man who betrayed her, Simon Deutz, who was the son of France's chief rabbi, And it's about the firestorm of hatred against Jews that the Betrayal unleashed, which I argue was the first real outpouring of anti-Semitism in modern France and set the stage for the Dreyfus Affair some 60 years later. Let me move to, okay. So at the heart of the story is the Duchess de Berry, who was born Maria Carolina Ferdinanda Luisa di Borbone in Naples in 1798. She was the granddaughter of the king from the Neapolitan branch of the Bourbon royal family. In 1816, she married her much older distant cousin, the Duc de Berry, who was the nephew of King Louis XVIII of France, and she came to Paris just as the Bourbon Restoration was getting underway. With her flair for fashion, lavish expenditures on clothes, and patronage of the arts, she quickly became the toast of Paris. And in the book, I discuss some of the fashion trends she inaugurated, including very high hairdos to disguise her short stature and high hemlines to show off her famously tiny feet. So in 1820, the Duke was assassinated in front of the opera by a Bonapartist named Louvel and bled to death in the Duchess's arms, turning her into a heroine for the far right, the ultra-royalists. And here is an image of the Duke's deathbed in the foyer of the opera, one of the many images of this scene that circulated for years afterwards. It was really after she gave birth to a son, 8 months after her husband's assassination, though, that the Duchess became an important political figure in France. She had saved the Bourbon monarchy by producing a last-minute heir, the so-called enfant du miracle. And here is an image of the Duchess with her son, the Duc de Bordeaux, a few years later. When the Bourbons were forced out of France yet again during the Revolution of 1830, and Louis Philippe, who was both the Duchess's distant cousin and her uncle, became king of the French, the Duchess, really alone among the Bourbon royal family, vowed to act. From exile, first in Scotland and then in Italy, she began conspiring to organize an insurrection that would restore the throne to her son. Now, she surrounded herself in exile with a group of sycophantic supporters who egged her on, either in the hope of personal gain, should she manage to pull off her far-fetched plan, or out of a sense of desperation to at least do something to counter the revolutionary tide. Almost all of these supporters were drawn from the high nobility, but the Duchess made one exception, and it would prove her undoing. So Simon Deutz was not the type of person who would normally associate with royalty. He was a commoner, an immigrant to France from Germany, and he had worked as a lowly printer's apprentice. But most surprisingly, perhaps, he had been born a Jew. As I said, he was the son of France's chief rabbi, Emmanuel Deutz. In 1828, though, toward the end of the Restoration, Simon shocked France's small Jewish community by converting to Catholicism. The Restoration, of course, was a time when the Catholic Church was trying to regain the power and influence it had lost during the Revolution and was actively pursuing high-profile conversions, which it then bragged about in the clerical press. And it was such a big deal that the son of France's chief rabbi had converted that Simon was invited to Rome and put on the Vatican payroll. And the Pope himself, Pope Gregory XVI, introduced him to the Duchess as someone she could trust as she prepared to launch her civil war. In April of 1832, the Duchess set sail from Massa on the Tuscan seacoast and landed secretly in Marseille, hoping that her presence would ignite a popular uprising against the newly formed and already quite unpopular July monarchy. When this uprising fizzled due to some hilariously poor planning, she probably should have hightailed it back to Italy, but instead she doubled down and decided to carry on her civil war in the Vendée, the far western province that had long been a hotbed of traditional Catholicism and anti-revolutionary fervor. Dressed in a series of increasingly outlandish disguises, including that of a peasant boy, she led her legitimist guerrilla army in a series of skirmishes against government troops. Things did not go well for the Duchess, and soon she was on the run. She eventually sought refuge in the attic of some supporters in Nantes in June of 1832. And here's a picture that I took of the house where she hid, which, if you know Nantes, is right near the chateau of the Dukes of Burgundy, right in the center of town. Meanwhile, Simon Deutz decided to switch sides. After fulfilling a delicate mission for the Duchess, he delivered a message to the courts of Spain and Portugal requesting money and arms for her insurrection. By the summer of 1832, he realized her campaign was going to fail. And it was at that point that he offered his services to Adolphe Thiers, Louis-Philippe's Minister of the Interior, promising to lead the police to the Duchess's hiding place in Nantes. On the night of November 16th, 1832, police raided this house where the Duchess was hiding, but at first they couldn't find her because she had slipped along with 3 accomplices into a tiny closet behind the fireplace in the attic. And here's a picture of the attic, and you can see at the bottom there's a diagram of the attic, and that shaded kind of trapezoidal space behind the fireplace is the tiny closet, where she stayed for 16 hours while the police ransacked the house. But eventually she was forced to surrender after the soldiers guarding the room decided to light a fire. She was literally smoked out. And here is an image of the Duchess emerging from the fireplace in a popular print from the time. After her capture, the Duchess was sent to prison, where she once again became a martyr for the Legitimists. That is, until it emerged that she was pregnant, despite not having had a husband now for over a decade. It didn't look good, obviously, that the leader of the Legitimist Party was about to have an illegitimate child in prison. The Duchess tried to circumvent the rumors by claiming that she had gotten married again in secret to an Italian count, but it was clear to almost everyone that this was a ruse. Louis-Philippe forced his rebellious niece to give birth in front of witnesses so she couldn't deny the pregnancy, and then promptly deported her to Naples, effectively ending her political career. Her Bourbon former in-laws kept her away from her children, but she had a large and happy new family with the impromptu husband, the Italian count. She died in Austria in 1870, nearly blind and bankrupt, and of course the Bourbons never did regain the French throne. This is a picture of a photo of the Duchess in her later bitter years in the 1860s. Simon Deutz, meanwhile, became infamous, his name serving as a byword for treachery for at least a century. After squandering the 500,000 francs he received for the betrayal, he fled France, and he seems to have died under an assumed name in New Orleans in 1844. And here's a receipt for the 500,000 francs signed by Deutz in the papers of Adolphe Thiers. So in the book, I recount this forgotten history. It's kind of a double biography of the Duchess and Deutz, but I also explore how the case lived on in French memory until at least World War II. I talk about the various French writers who were obsessed with the case, including Chateaubriand, who volunteered to act as the Duchess's lawyer, Hugo, who wrote an anti-Semitic poem about Deutz in 1835, and especially Dumas père, who returned to the case again and again, including in his memoirs and in an 1858 novel he wrote about the case, Les Louves de Machecoul. I also show how the case became a favorite talking point for anti-Semites and would crop back up again at moments of anti-Semitic tension, like the Dreyfus Affair and Vichy, whenever anti-Semites wanted to stir up hatred against France's Jews. And that's the overview of the book. I will stop my share and turn it over to Andrew.
Thank you so much, Maury. Thank you for that overview of this. I don't think we've shown the physical object yet, so I'm going to hold it up fetishistically, complete with post-it notes. It's a really compelling read. It's very exciting, and it's a kind of rocambolesque story. So I can strongly recommend it, in addition to the great kind of erudition and scholarship in it. The first question that I wanted to put to you really is about audience. And I feel like a moment ago I had a little picture of Janet Beiser at the top of the screen. So I felt like I wanted to talk about family plots and Oedipal narratives. You, at the very end of the book, in the acknowledgements, you say, my father was thrilled I was finally writing something that normal people might actually read. And so I don't want to insist on the Oedipal narrative, but I am interested in the question of audience and who you feel that you were writing the book for, and how that changed your approach to writing and your approach to storytelling.
Yeah, so this was a, thank you for that question. This was a big departure for me, and I really wanted to write a book that foregrounded the narrative. So it does have an argument about anti-Semitism and the origins of modern anti-Semitism in this case. But the narrative comes, is really, as I said, foregrounded. And I did that partly to reach a new and different kind of audience, not just my dad. I remember actually with my dissertation showing it to my father, and he said, yeah, I decided to read until I couldn't understand anymore, and I got most of the way through the first paragraph, which was, I thought that it was pretty clear. But anyway, this was going to be, I wanted to write a book that that actual people could read, not just academics, but also I felt like this was something that was important to tell this story. And in fact, that the narrative had to take center, have a central focus, partly because it was the narrative that really got people interested in the case at the time, that people were fascinated because of the story and because of the characters at the heart of it. So people either identified with the Duchess or identified against Deutz, and this was one of the reasons that the case had such an important role in fostering anti-Semitism. So this is how it connects to my argument, that it was partly because it was such a gripping story, and it was a story that seemed to read like a kind of parable of modernity, of the Duchess who represented the last gasp of the feudal past, and she was undone by this shape-shifting modern Jewish guy. This story gave French people at the time a way to understand everything that was scary that was happening in their lives, and this abrupt shift to modern industrial capitalism and to urbanization and all kinds of scary things. They were able to map these changes onto this story. So that's one of the reasons that I think I also wanted to write a more narrative history.
Right. I mean, it's very rare that one says Drummond was right. But you have that excellent quote from Drummond where he sort of says, all the characters are in the right place. There's something so kind of archetypal about the way this story falls into place. I think that's a really interesting moment of kind of meta anti-Semitism, where he kind of thinks about what it is that he's doing as an anti-Semite. I suppose the other question then that I wanted to ask you was about the kind of motivation to tell this story now, and especially to tell it to an Anglophone audience. I mean, one of the things that I often wonder when we write in English about French stuff is who we think we're writing for. And I suppose one of the ways that one might think about the work of a scholar who works on a foreign culture would be to think of them as a passeur, although it's not often that we do think about ourselves that way particularly. But is this a story that you particularly wanted to tell to an Anglophone audience? And the other question that I wanted to kind of tie into that is that you say right at the end of the book, by reviving the case, I'm taking a calculated risk, by which you mean by reviving this case at this moment, you're taking a calculated risk. So I wonder if you could think about those questions of language and audience, and also of timeliness in the moment.
Yeah. Well, when I when I set out to write this, and to write it for a more popular audience, it means finding a kind of trade publisher for it. And Basic Books published it. But I was warned by a lot of people that this, unfortunately, this is the period that we work on, that the Restoration and July monarchy is the least saleable moment in French history. That, people are, Anglophone audiences are interested in the French Revolution. They're kind of interested in the fin de siècle, but the middle of the 19th century is a big black hole. And I think not only for Anglophone audiences. I mean, I think that, in France also, I think the July monarchy gets a lot less attention than other periods. And from my kind of very unscientific survey of French people, French historians, even, very few people had heard about this case. Even French Jewish historians had not heard about this case. So part of what I wanted to do was tell this story and describe this period, which I don't think I have to, make the sale to this audience, but, I think is a really important period for understanding how modernity develops. The Restoration and July monarchy is really key. So that was part of my goal, was to kind of restore the centrality of this period to a wider audience. But in terms of the calculated risk, I was aware, as I was writing it, that some people might object to the fact that I'm writing about a Jewish guy who betrays the Duchess at a time when anti-Semitism is on the rise, not just in France, but in the United States, around the world. And, Deutz, unlike Dreyfus, Dreyfus is kind of a model victim of anti-Semitism, right? He's, completely innocent, he's framed, and, everyone can celebrate that story as the victory of truth. This one is much more murky, because even if Deutz, he's accused of being a traitor to France. I think that's an exaggeration. He betrayed the Duchess, who was leading a civil war against the French government. But, he was, I think that, it's clear that he was a kind of opportunist, a narcissist, a liar. He was a scoundrel in many ways. So what does it mean to write a book about a bad Jew? And this is the thing that I think all minority groups face. Is it bad for the Jews, or is it, are you doing something that you really, airing our dirty laundry kind of thing? And my response to that is that, you can't selectively choose moments of history to focus on because they show things in the light that you would like them to. That this case was tremendously important for understanding the development of anti-Semitism. We can't wish that away, and we can't really understand that development unless you focus on the facts of the case. So that's what I try to do. I try to really explain in the case why so many people at the time were so willing to generalize from this Jewish scoundrel to all Jews. That is what I think is really important to understand at the time. Why people saw him as representative of the race. But by showing that, I hope to try to diffuse some of the negative feelings that became associated with him.
Sure. I mean, that's probably one way of segueing to talking a bit more about Deutz's character. Lauren Pinsker has already asked in the chat, had Deutz not been Jewish, would his betrayal of her have been seen as potentially a legitimate unmasking of a traitor to Louis Philippe? And you've just made the point that this was not a betrayal of France by any means, although I suppose it depends what you mean by France. And there was one quotation that I had meant to talk about when we were talking about audience, actually. The question is, how do you explain to an audience who knows nothing about France how incredibly insane, almost ironic, the following quotation must sound? This is Deutz explaining why he did what he did. I was acting not in the interest of a party, an opinion, but in the sacred interest of humanity in general. France was my love, Louis Philippe, my utopia, with a capital U. Now, the idea of saying Louis Philippe is my utopia, this is not something that our studies of the July monarchy have led us to think is a widespread attitude to the July monarchy. I mean, how do you think about that question of motivation, of legitimacy, of betrayal? What is the betrayal?
Right. Well, so yeah, so Deutz wrote a self-justifying memoir a couple years later, so in 1835, and thinking that this would help his case. In fact, it makes it much worse. But his argument there is that he did it to save France from civil war, that the Duchess was leading this, this armed insurrection against the French government to try to bring back the monarchy. She was, a reactionary. She was, exemplar of all the kind of old regime values that, she was the counter-revolution. So I think that was what Deutz was hoping to use to justify it, that he was acting in a kind of revolutionary way to forestall the legitimists from taking power again. Of course, what he done, what's not explained there is that just 2 years before he had been, whole hog for the Duchess. So, it was really only when it seemed like she would fail that he developed this, fondness for Louis Philippe. But I should say, though, that that Louis Philippe, that a lot of France's Jews did support Louis Philippe. He actually did do some good things. He put rabbis on the state payroll in 1831, effectively putting Judaism on a par with Catholicism and Protestantism. So in fact, it wasn't that far-fetched for, someone Jewish to say that they really, liked Louis Philippe at the time.
I mean, so as you described it at the beginning, this book is a dual biography. Although we've discussed previously that one of the subjects of this dual biography is much more knowable than the other, and that Deutz, both from a kind of psychological point of view, but also basically from an evidentiary point of view, is much harder to get a handle on. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting is when you talk about his political beliefs. You say, in reality, Deutz doesn't seem to have held any political beliefs at all. Instead, he adopted whatever opinion he thought most advantageous in the moment. And that immediately made me think of Julien Sorel and of Lucien Leuven, of Stendhal characters, and whether Deutz is like a Stendhal character would seem to us if we didn't have access to their inner worlds and therefore view them through the sympathy that they have for themselves. I mean, what ultimately did your attitude to Deutz become? How do you feel about him, just affectively? What do you like him, or?
Yeah, I tried. Well, so that was really one of the challenges of the book, because the Duchess is this right-wing person who has, terrible politics that I completely disagree with. She's this incredibly sympathetic, sort of witty, courageous, heroic, I think we can say, person. And it's really hard not to like her in a certain way. And part of what I was interested in the book is how this whole mythology developed around her. And I try to give a sense of that. It's really not hard to see when you start to study her, why so many people were willing to fight for her cause and why she became, the standard bearer of the Legitimist Party. Deutz is a scoundrel. He's a villain. He's almost an archetypal villain. So that was another challenge, how to try to, I felt like I owed it to him to try to find some sympathy or at least some understanding with what motivated him to, first of all, really hurt his father, by converting. His father is the chief rabbi of France. He knows it's going to cause a huge scandal. It's the most embarrassing thing he can possibly do. And he does it anyway, really to get ahead. I think it's pretty clear he feels no religious belief, that leads him to convert to Catholicism, because then he converts back to Judaism when he thinks that'll help him later. But, without overly psychologizing, I do suggest some Freudian possibilities. I think that he has, an archetypal family romance. He seeks out these alternative, grandiose parental figures, the Duchess and the Pope, who he, allies himself to. And in a sense, he, I think you're right to, to make the link with Stendhal, which I do in the book too, because in many ways his hypocrisy is just like Julien Sorel. And I think in what I try to show ultimately in the book is that he really is in some ways totally atypical. I mean, he does things that no one else did, but he reflects trends from the time. So he's very much a man of the generation of 1830. He's a kind of epitome of certain romantic tendencies, this idea that you can reinvent yourself totally. And he's also representative, I think, of a certain generation of Jews. So this is the first generation of Jews who had been born as French citizens, who are able to leave Judaism behind if they want, or totally reinvent themselves, become modern. And he, so I say in the book that he does what a whole generation of Jews maybe thought or dreamt of doing. He just takes it to an extreme.
Yeah, I mean, that's, so in a sense, you responded to Sarah Maz's question there. She says, I've sometimes read that the early 19th century in France was a golden age for Jews. Does this book aim to revise that narrative? Is the Deutsch story, in your view, symptomatic or causal? And you do actually, you treat it as more than symptomatic. In fact, you say that in a sense it's like an allegory or a parable of the story of the Jews under Napoleon. When I was reading that section where you say, it reads as a more extreme version of what an entire generation of Jews attempted to do or fantasized about doing, it could be seen as a parable of integration. You talked a lot about that terrible Hugo poem about Deutsch. But it made me think of that other Hugo poem about Hugo, Ce siècle avait 2 ans. Deutsch was also born in 1802, and that sense that this man's destiny is somehow tied into a grand historical narrative of France. It comes out really strongly in the book. I mean, one of the things that I think is symptomatic of that, and that goes way beyond anything that Stendhal ever dreamed about for his characters, is just the incredible access that this person who came from nowhere and nothing had to the Pope, to the Duchess. I mean, how do you explain the sheer velocity of his ascension?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly explained by some of the religious tensions that were going on at this time. So I think it's important. I alluded to this in my little overview, but that the Restoration was really this moment when the Catholic Church was engaged in a real struggle to regain its hegemony in France, the hegemony it had lost during the Revolution. And it saw converting high-profile Jews and also Protestants as a key part of that. And so that was one of the things that Deutsch realized that he could capitalize on. And so and he was right in a sense. So he was someone who was really going nowhere. He had tried all these different occupations. He was a printer's apprentice. He tried to have a wood business. He tried to follow his father into the rabbinate. He failed at everything. He was a big loser. And then he realized that conversion would offer him this path to fame and fortune. And he was not wrong in that. And it does. He's immediately, presented to the Pope. The Pope, supposedly calls him his friend and introduces him to the Duchess. But to go back to Sarah Maz's point about, I think that it's a really interesting question because we tend to think of the mid-19th century as this golden age precisely for French Jews. And there's this idea that anti-Semitism all of a sudden happens in the 1880s, and with Drummond and La France Juive, and that, it kind of comes out of nowhere. All of a sudden, there's this huge outpouring of anti-Semitism. And one of the things I try to show in the book is that, in fact, no, there is this much earlier anti-Semitic affair, as a result of this case in 1832. But of course, there were even earlier instances. Even this case did not come out of nowhere. There were anti-Semites on both the right and the left, the sort of early proto-socialists, Fourier, for example. And this case was the moment, this is my argument in the book, that Jews became identified in the popular imagination with everything that was bad about modernity, and that anti-Semitism became a key part of right-wing royalist ideology. So, yeah.
Okay, so much for Duchess then, and one of the things that I found most affecting about the book was his kind of disappearance at the end of it, essentially. I mean, I'd forgotten this line from that Hugo poem, actually, but in that first stanza, he says, "Cet enfant que la vie effacée de son livre." And that is not really very accurate as applied to Hugo, but as applied to Duchess, it's really true. He does completely disappear in a way that seems like the 500,000 francs didn't pan out very well for him, especially.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we've got this incredibly rich biographical subject in the Duchess. I mean, I'm interested in one of the things that you said. You don't really say it in the book, but you said it a couple of times in conversation, that you're uncomfortable with her politics. And I just, does she really have a politics? That is to say, is her version of politics not somehow so alien to us that it's actually kind of hard to take it seriously, almost? Might that be insidious seduction?
Right. I mean, she also is out for herself. So her vision of politics is that she wants her son on the throne, mm-hmm. and she wants to play a political role as regent of France. So I think that we can't act like we can't pretend that she's acting out of these pure, and noble purposes. And she's put to use by the Legitimist Party that really finds itself out in the cold in 1830 and is looking for a standard bearer that Charles X just refuses to be. He just is not, the rest of the Bourbon family is sort of resigned to their exile. They're maybe thinking, they've been exiled several times before, and maybe, these things, maybe one day they'll come back. She's the only one who is willing to fight for the Legitimist cause. And that's why a lot of young nobles rally to her cause. But it's true that it posed a difficulty in writing the book because almost everything is known about her. There were, dozens and dozens of books at the time that recorded seemingly every bon mot that she, uttered at the time, and relatively few trustworthy sources about Duchess. So there were a couple books about him, many written by his enemies. So there was this one that was possibly written by his brother-in-law. That's a whole other story, who he fell out with under a false name. And these obviously very, very anti-Semitic books. So that was a kind of challenge as a biographer. First of all, what to trust in the sources on Duchess, and then how to, if you're writing a double biography, how to keep the balance. And so that was, I don't know if I pulled that off, but that was what I tried to give, a full and complete picture of both of these people.
I mean, I feel like the at once very sharp and very soft focus that the Duchess lived her life in versus the kind of obscurity of Duchess is one of the most interesting things about the pairing. Something about, essentially, I think at the time and since, what makes the Duchess so appealing must ultimately be something about her relationship to her sex and to her femininity, and that there's an image here of a woman who claims an almost incredible degree of autonomy, but she has to claim it, right? It's not just that it doesn't just come to her by virtue of her birth, but there is a struggle for autonomy there, but who also experiences these moments of a complete loss of autonomy, of imprisonment, of helplessness, of dependency. I mean, what did you think about the kind of the place of gender norms and indeed sexuality norms in the writing of the book?
Yeah, that's something obviously you know a lot about, and I learned a lot from your book, The Amorous Restoration, about that. I mean, this was one of the questions in the book, like how come this woman who is, representing traditional Catholicism, family values, the old regime, norms, is this gender-bending, cross-dressing female military leader? How to reconcile those two things. And what I try to explain in the book is that, unlike her contemporary Sand, for instance, who also, as we know, cross-dressed at around the same time, Sand was, of course, doing it to challenge patriarchal structures. That is not what the Duchess is doing. So she is, I think, just sees herself in the lineage of aristocratic women from the old regime to whom, traditional rules didn't necessarily apply. She sees herself above bourgeois family values that Louis Philippe notably did not. Louis Philippe makes that a part of his public persona. But the Duchess just, for instance, just doesn't get why it's such a big deal that she's having an affair, and why, then it emerges she's pregnant, even though she doesn't have a husband. The Comtesse de Boigne, who's one of the kind of witty commentators on this case, says any servant girl would have thrown herself down a well rather than admit what the Duchess did. But to the Duchess, she's like, I'm the Duchess. I don't need to follow, these rules. So she kind of doesn't get it. And then, modernity catches up with her and she realizes that, this dooms her enterprise and she's exiled, because of it. So it's really a case, I think, of these shifting. I mean, this is something you talk about in your book too, that these different regimes of norms exist at the same time. And the Restoration is really one of those key moments where people are, there's a modern sense of sexuality and gender norms, and then there are, other competing ones. And the Duchess is really someone in whom those tensions are, kind of clash.
I mean, that's it, isn't it? And so you talked about her giving birth in public at Louis Philippe's command in 1832. That was, of course, the second time that she'd done that. Right. The first time being in September 1820. And it's the Comtesse de Boigne who talks about her royale impudeur, right? That right. she doesn't care because she belongs to this different regime of the body and of sexuality. Yeah. And I always wonder, I mean, when I'm writing about this period, whether I'm being seduced through a kind of optical illusion into seeing rebellion and transgression and even a kind of queerness where there is in fact just a holdover of an older regime which conflicts with a regime of norms that I now perceive as being more or less modern, which seems like it seems like a tempting argument to spin, but it's maybe not always a persuasive one. Yeah,
I mean, so a lot of what I try to do in the book is read the press from the time. So I read all these, different newspapers, which helpfully all had a very clear political opinion. So you can just really tell how the different sides are viewing the case. And it's clear that these issues of her impudeur did matter for certain people at the time. So her pregnancy becomes the source of hilarious innuendo for the left-wing press, and especially for, there's one, my favorite newspaper from the time is Le Corsaire, which is this sort of satiric journal that has, every day they have a new witty epigram about the Duchess's pregnancy. And this, of course, leads to, people fight duels on her behalf. That was one of the things that I found, just fascinating and also relevant for our own moment how, I was reading this, at the height of the Mueller investigation into Trump, and I was thinking, how can people not, how are they willing to believe, to not see things that are obviously true and to believe things that are obviously not. And I realized that, political ideology does that to people, or at least, seems to. So.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading about the duels, essentially one of the threads that runs through the book is what Robert Nye calls masculinity and male codes of honor, right? That's to say that really the betrayal is a betrayal of male codes of honor rather than, although the word that's used is France, what it means is a version of France imagined according to those codes of honor rather than any real sense of the government. So the other thing that I think comes out of thinking about the Duchess and that different regime of the body, but is much more broadly true in the book. It seems like it's a much more physical book than anything that I've ever written about. That is to say that the way that the body and the realities of being a body in space and time are encoded in the story goes beyond anything that I've ever had to deal with, starting with physical sources, but going down to the exigencies of how you go to the toilet when you spent 15 hours trapped in a chimney. So, was that, were you aware of that as you were writing it? That there was something grimy and real about what you were writing about?
Yeah, the answer to that question is a hat. So, one of the people she was trapped in the closet, this guy, Achille Guibourg, who's probably the father of the illegitimate child, he offers his hat to be used as a chamber pot during those 16 hours in the closet. And then he's forever after called Guibourg Chapeau because of that. But yeah, I mean, her body is, I mean, as you said, going back to when she's first forced to give birth in public to prove that this child that was supposedly conceived, immediately before her husband's, assassination is really her own. She, has to give birth in public, and they call in witnesses to this, and, they see it. And she, so that definitely is part of it. And then I would also add to that Deutz's body is also very central to this story. So I showed that image of him. We don't have any photograph of him. We have various drawings of him that I would say are more or less anti-Semitic, but they all show him having very exaggerated Jewish features, almost to the point, interestingly, in that image, I've shown that image before, and people say he looks black in that image. He looks like he's African, of African descent. And I think that's true, that he does look like that. I have no way of really knowing, but that is how he was described. His complexion, everything about him was, everything about his body was dissected. And this is, I think, one of the first moments that Jews are beginning to be talked about as a race. I mean, this is before, the advent of real scientific racism, which, is more the second half of the 19th century, but these currents are in the air, and that's definitely a big part of the story too.
Yeah, I mean, the other aspect of physicality that I thought loomed all the way through the book in a way that I bet you weren't thinking about at the time, but probably have thought a lot about since, is disease, right? Which actually it provides a kind of rhythm to the book in some ways. Could you tell us a little bit about the kind of the way stations of disease that crop up?
Yeah, so first of all, the book was published on April 14th, so at the height of the pandemic. And it's a coincidence, but that the cholera pandemic of 1832 plays a big role in the story. So I have a chapter devoted to cholera. And, the parallels are amazing. So, cholera hits France in March of 1832. About 20,000 Parisians die within a couple months. people are terrified because they don't understand, they don't have the germ theory of disease yet. They have a sense that it has something to do with poverty because more poor people are dying than rich people. Now, in fact, we know that cholera is caused by contaminated food and water. And so in the kind of more densely populated poorer districts, more people died. And also, like today, wealthy people fled to their country houses. And but it really exacerbated political tensions at the time. So rich people blamed poor people for spreading disease. And then poor people actually literally thought that the rich were trying to poison them. So there were all these rumors that, they were, the wells had been poisoned, and Gisquet, who's the police chief at the time, kind of stokes these rumors, and it causes all kinds of, political tension and leads to even more dissatisfaction with Louis Philippe. And this is the moment that the Duchess chooses to launch her invasion. Of course, it's also the moment that the left, that the Republicans choose to launch their revolt. This is the revolt that is the centerpiece of Les Miserables. So that's happening at this time. That it's actually, they stage it during the funeral of General Lamarck, who is this kind of leftist hero who died of cholera. But the Duchess from Italy is watching this and sees cholera as God's punishment for 50 years of revolution, and offers herself as the solution, that it's only by returning to the legitimate monarchy that France can work its way out. So definitely disease plays a huge part in the book.
And yet she arrived in 1816 with the plague, right? I mean, she didn't have the plague, but the plague was around.
Right.
The first meeting between the Duchess, you say on page 23, the first meeting between the Duchess and the French courtiers who were going to take her up to Fontainebleau was through a protective screen, this kind of physically distanced encounter between the Duchess and the courtiers. Yeah. Okay, I think we should maybe take a couple more questions. And actually, there's two that can probably be coordinated together in that they are both, I guess, about your subject's awareness or not of the kind of models that they seem to be emulating. So David Powell asks, is there anything we know about Dutz's literary exposure? In other words, can we suppose that he'd read Julien Sorel? And Sarah Mazur asks, with respect to the Duchess's pregnancy, there seems to be a lot of religious themes. Did she ever consciously model herself on Joan of Arc? Her earlier child was referred to as the Enfant du Miracle. Could the other one have been framed as a sort of immaculate conception? Or is that a reach? What do you think? To what extent is there a knowingness in the Duchess's sort of coining of those topoi, and how self-reflexive was Dutz? Do you have any evidence that he was a reader of fiction? Or
yeah, so there's, I think it's unlikely. I actually talk about this in the book. I think it's unlikely that he had read Stendhal. Not that many people did. At the time, he was not one of the happy few.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Yeah, but he had a spotty education. So he probably went to one of the kind of Jewish schools in the capital, but it didn't amount to much. I mean, he would have, learned the rudiments of, reading Hebrew. But, he wrote French fluently, but he did not know Latin. That's a really significant thing. And when he converts, that's what he goes to Rome to do, is to learn Latin. So, he didn't get a kind of, elite education at the time. And then the Duchess definitely does look to these models, Joan of Arc is a big one for her, and certainly for her supporters. So she, I'm trying to remember now if she specifically compares herself to Joan of Park, she unfortunately did not write an autobiography, but her supporters definitely do make those comparisons and are constantly seeing her in, comparison with also her royal ancestors. So Henry IV and, other, people like that. But yes, in this kind of heroic female role too.
And can we assume that there was never any suggestion that this 1832 pregnancy was miraculous?
Yes, we can. I don't think, it was jokingly referred to in that
Right.
way.
Yeah.
But, there was a lot of speculation.
One of the ones you quote is La Duchesse se révèle enceinte.
Right, exactly. That was one of the poems, so enceinte in every way. But, that was one of the kind of big sources of speculation. Who is the father? Some people even, hypothesized that it was Duchess who was the father, which I'm pretty sure it wasn't. And that, I leave, somewhat open in the book, although I think it was this guy, Guibourg, who was in hiding with her before, and who was a kind of dashing lawyer and, age appropriate. So.
Okay, and so I'm conscious that a lot of what I'm saying is quite kind of anecdotal and trivial. So actually, Jeremy Popkin has asked quite a serious question, which will maybe bring us back to the intellectual core of the book. He asks, I have a question about your use of the notion that Duchess is a representative figure of modernity. Is there a danger that you're reproducing right-wing categories from the period by identifying modernity with self-interest, dishonesty, etc.? I'm sure you'll want to respond to that.
Yeah. What I was trying to show is why he became that kind of figure. So why so many people saw that in him. So I don't think that by pointing that out, I'm reproducing it, but he definitely was this figure of cosmopolitanism, of he was an immigrant to France. These things are all true about him, and that's one of the things that I think makes this story, as I said, not a something that Jewish historians, for the most part, have wanted to write about. And I think that's one of the reasons that the story has fallen into relative oblivion since World War II. So at the end of the book, I trace the history of the memory of the case, and I say that since World War II, it largely hasn't been, talked about, and Jewish historians especially haven't. And I think it's for that reason. One of the few who has, there was an article from the 1950s where this guy, Tchaikovsky, tries to argue that he didn't take money for the betrayal, even though we know that he did. We have the receipt, and there actually is a letter also that he writes to Louis Philippe saying that, I received money. So again, I'm trying to, I'm not trying to espouse these things. I'm trying to show how he was seen at the time and why.
So again, another question about that kind of historiography, I suppose, of anti-Semitism. David Montgomery says, Jews were arguably one of the big three conspiratorial bugbears of the French far right in the 19th century, along with Freemasons and Protestants. Robert Toombs writes that Jews were relative latecomers to the Great Revolutionary Conspiracy. Most vocal anti-Semitic paranoia came from the left during the first half of the century, which you've already referred to, with Jews being seen as the incarnation of cosmopolitan capitalism. So his question is, how does the Berry-Dutz saga complicate this interpretation, and how much does it sort of mesh with it, sit alongside it?
Yeah, so it's true that, people had hated Jews for thousands of years, but something changes in the 19th century. People have long recognized that something is changing in the 19th century. And one of the things that changes is that prior to the revolution, the Jews were largely hated for religious reasons, as kind of ahistorical devotees of a superseded religion. Then somehow in the 19th century, they start to become associated with everything that was scary about modernity, as I said. That definitely starts on the left, and it's, proto-socialists like Fourier, who from the very, early 19th century are denouncing Jews as, agents of a nefarious capitalism. But it's really around this case, my argument in the book, that anti-Semitism becomes a key part of right-wing ideology. And that's because these two characters, as I said, so perfectly represent this clash of old world values, the kind of feudal past, with what these displaced aristocrats were bemoaning. And that was exemplified by Deutsch. So that's my argument in the book, that is pretty new in this period, and that it's really around this case that those feelings kind of coalesce into an identifiable political ideology.
Okay. And so we've got time for one last question, I suppose. This points in maybe a more optimistic direction. So Catherine Bartlett asked, you talk about cultural myths. Maybe you can say a little bit more about what you mean about cultural myths, but Catherine mentions the myth of Judas. She says, according to Levi-Strauss, myths do not die, but transform. They go dormant. They can be attenuated. Would you agree that that can happen if Jews and non-Jews cultivate positive relationships? I mean, how are you envisaging this intervention, the betrayal of the Duchess, contributing to some kind of working through of cultural myths?
Yeah, I think, I like to think of this as, one of the things that history can do, that by shining a light on these things, by explaining how they came about, you diffuse the power of the myths. And so that was, certainly one of my goals in the book, to explore, to kind of historicize the myth, in my view, is one of the ways to diffuse it.
Well, I mean, I think you really do achieve that, but mostly it's just a kind of fascinating book about a really fascinating and forgotten episode. I'm sure you've made everybody want to read it. So thank you for talking about it with us today. I'm going to pass back to Susan to finish the session off, maybe.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, thank you for your questions.
Well, I'm here to say thank you both of you for coming and coming, you're home. Thank you for being together with us apart and for that fantastic conversation. This was so interesting. Masha put the link to the book, to buy the book, in the chat, so everybody can find it there if you haven't gotten it yet. This was terrific, a great way to start our first NCFS in Captivity. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Maureen. I know everybody else will join.